28 female, my hyper-religious parents raised us to be very codependent and I'm tired of carrying the burden for the sake of my siblings. I grew up in a middle-class, somewhat privileged Christian household with extremely fundamentalist views. The church we went to functioned similarly to Jehovah's Witness. You had to be vetted and then if you left you were withdrawn from, a nice fluffy way to say excommunicated. As the oldest I suspect I probably faced the brunt of their parenting style. My brothers have all experienced a certain degree of emotional abuse from them, and even the ones who were considered favorites have been butting heads with them recently. The codependency is extremely clear. None of my brothers were encouraged to get a college education, one of them chose to and was given a major hassle about it. When I moved out at 25 it was an emotional crying fest and they said I betrayed them by wanting to leave and that I would never get married living on my own, because apparently independence is unattractive. Since I was 19 I recognized the deep codependent issues between me and my parents and set out to change it early on by visiting a psychologist and a psychiatrist and being very careful not to take the church's expectations to heart. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done. However, at least 2 to 4 times a year I have to do damage control on some situation that is happening at home with my brothers, or I get blamed for influencing them in a worldly direction. My parents can be extremely cutthroat, and the only reason I visit regularly is because I'm terrified of my younger brother who is only 15, doing something to himself or getting emotionally abused into depression. 2 of my brothers are developing into my parents and making the situation worse. They are borderline religious zealots. The other 2 brothers are in concerning situations, one of them is in school and the other is literally a social hermit. With no friends and sits in his room isolated from the world, and his family for the majority of his time outside of work. He also works for my dad. My brother who is in college is the one currently facing some of the worst backlash because he has a girlfriend, told them about it. And my parents blame me for influencing him and told him he can't live at home anymore knowing how impossible that is for him financially. The trouble is, this is having a major influence on my health. I am a chronic insomniac, my iron levels are constantly low, cortisol levels are high. My hair falls out during stressful times to the point where it's much thinner than it was 3 years ago. I have definitely struggled through depressive episodes and have diagnosed anxiety. I get constant colds and my immune system gets very weak, chest tightness is so common and I'm developing shortness of breath which is worrisome as my family has a history of heart conditions. Below is a bullet point list of all the relevant factors from my upbringing that psychologists and psychiatrists agree leads to complications in adulthood due to emotional abuse. I have only included ones that I very significantly identify with. 1. Comparing siblings to one another. Often my parents would praise 2 of my brothers because of how well they listened and obeyed them in all aspects. These 2 siblings took every bit of my parents' advice. Often when we got in trouble we would all be compared to them as the standard. They even referred to them as the good boys. 2. Raised to be codependent, independence was the equivalent to being willful and far from God. If you disobeyed them, you disobeyed God. God was ashamed of you. God hated what was in you. Obey your parents, and all will be well and you will be blessed. If you deviate from that, there is something deeply sinful and wrong with you. This sign is perhaps the most common and potent one that makes me feel physically ill thinking about. 3. Guilt trip. Because they had a contentious relationship with most of our extended family, there were guilt trips when we wanted to do things with our cousins, or were included on family outings. They would often be very contrary to my grandparents, and while the extended family was also full of control freaks, my parents would match that energy, creating a very tense environment at family gatherings. My grandparents barely speak to my dad and dislike my mom. Sometimes when I would bond with my extended family they would guilt trip me about it, and how I was taking sides or betraying them in some way. 4. Unrealistic expectations. Had to be home from school within half an hour, no after-school hangouts with worldly people, no parties, no extracurricular clubs and activities, hang out with church kids only. If you step out of line, consequences are severe. One example is that my phone was taken away for an entire year due to arriving home an hour after school finished. 5. Victim card. Often I would cry and express my feelings about something that they did that hurt me or something others did that hurt me, breakups, and they would either turn the narrative around to how difficult it was for them to deal with this, or how Jesus faced so much worse than I could ever imagine. The phrase "quit your sobbing" was common. They never believed me when I told them about red flags in my dating relationships. I was always the problem until others confirmed I wasn't. Comforting hugs were rare and I still feel weird when I get hugged by romantic partners, it makes me feel guilty. 6. Intimidated you with cruel and unusual punishment. Spankings were common, although I wouldn't say they were really the greatest issue, to be honest. In fact, probably the least damaging. The most damaging was when they would engage the silent treatment, and make the other siblings do it too. We'd be sitting at the table and I'd say, "Dad, can you pass the hot sauce?" and he would refuse to acknowledge me and would motion for one of my siblings to pass it. This would go on for days, sometimes a full week. My mom was an expert at this, but when she finally told you what she was mad about, it would be a raging anger, sometimes abusive but most often cruel and deeply cutting. What's wrong with you? Do you have any idea how disappointed God is? You can't be a part of this household behaving like that. At one point my dad took my tiny brother out in the car to show him other houses who might like to have him instead of us. He came back to the house sobbing and clinging to my mom. 7. Gaslighting. I always felt like I was the crazy one, that I was fundamentally flawed, that I deserved to be dumped by my boyfriends, that I deserved to get cheated on. I would confide in them and then the information would be used against me at a later date. During one of the biggest divisions between us and our extended family, my dad put me in the line of fire instead of owning the decision for the family. I was 18, and for around 5 years felt that I was the only one responsible for the relationship breakdown in our family. 8. No respect for boundaries. My computer always had extreme parental restrictions on it. My dad would sift through my searches relentlessly. They had forwarded my email accounts to them, so they were secretly reading all my interactions with my friends. Prohibited me from using their Wi-Fi until I was 22. Unless I gave them control over my cell phone. Read my diary when I was a teenager. Would repeatedly search through my room when I was at work. I would sometimes set up traps so I could tell when my mom had been rummaging through my things. 9. Love is conditional. Unless we were perfect, love was questionable. My youngest brother told me he can't remember the last time he was hugged by either parent, and truly believes my dad hates him. Sometimes I would see my brothers ask, "Do you still love me?" after getting in trouble, and my dad would just shrug his shoulders. Basically, I want to cut myself off from my parents, it's so utterly toxic. But I feel this deep grief and anxiety that my brothers will be in danger. Or that they will never grow and develop, and just give up and continue to rely on my parents instead of making adult decisions. My greatest worry is for my 15-year-old brother. He's already exhibiting symptoms of social anxiety and is always seeking out validation and trying to get affection from others through excessive giving and kind acts. I've come to the end of my rope and I don't know how to proceed. At 28 I feel a deep sense of shame that I'm still this messed up from everything, and I need to look after myself. But I can't abandon my brothers either. I feel you. A lot. I was raised in a Catholic household, forced to go like you to celebrations and to publicly tell prayers. I was punished if I did something wrong with violence and anger. I eventually distanced myself at the age of 20. May I suggest watching Theramentry's videos? He is very good at putting down emotions and rationalize them to process the events. You don't owe your siblings or your parents anything. They didn't teach you, they indoctrinated you. They didn't love you, they tried to carve a puppet out of you. Recovering from religion takes a long time, but it's absolutely possible and gives a thrilling feeling of finally getting back the freedom you deserve. Stay strong. You're not alone. That's really helpful and the type of stuff that is useful for me to listen to on the way home from work or in the comfort of my living room while I clean. I feel very responsible to provide my brothers with love, to a point where I feel their emotions so acutely, even if I'm not there and all I'm reading are their texts. While I have the courage now to bite back when my parents lash out at me, my brothers all live at home and don't have autonomy over their lives. The current economic circumstances have made it much harder for them to take the next steps and be independent, but with the exception of my 15-year-old brother. I also need to realize they are all in their 20s, and capable of finding their own solutions, because I am now encouraging them to be dependent on me. Wow. I feel like I literally just read my exact situation. I hurt so deeply for you and feel your pain. Everything is the same for me except that I only have one sister and I came out as bi. I'm so sorry that was an added element of shame for you. particularly if you identify with the religious upbringing that I had. I have seen firsthand how cruelly the honest, personal discoveries about yourself can be treated by parents. Let alone an entire extremist community on top of that. Have you talked to your siblings about this stuff? You're not necessarily presented with a binary choice between either putting up with your parents or leaving your siblings out to dry. You can at least make it clear to them what you see is going on, so that they have the chance to understand their own situations and respond for themselves. If you have the ability and capacity, too, you can maybe do something to help make up for your parents' failures. Try and let them know that you're willing to love and accept them for who they are, even if y'all's parents aren't. I suppose I wasn't too clear about why I get involved. The reason I feel the way I do and I still visit frequently is that I get tasked by my brothers to get involved. Or they reach out for help, or ask to stay with me, or simply need advice. They know I'm there for them, but they also know I'm stronger than them and don't give a shit what people think of me. So I'm the strength they can't find in some situations. It's very frequent, and unfortunately because my parents are literal stalkers, they somehow find out about me being the one they confide in, or they pry it out of them using the same old mental head games. And it's just a clusterfuck. That's a lot to deal with, and honestly, considering where you've been, you've come a long way. You're doing better than most people would under similar conditions. Kudos to you. Remember that your first responsibility is to yourself. As much as you love your brothers, I wouldn't recommend trying to save them at the expense of your own well-being. It sounds like there's still some lingering codependency there. I had to dump my parents' religion too. Experienced being ostracized, not allowed to associate with my younger siblings, been called the son of Satan, etc. Sometimes you just gotta roll with the punches. Anyhow, keep up your journey and remember that it's never okay for anyone to treat you badly. You deserve love and respect, and if you can learn to love and respect yourself, others will follow that example. I wish all the best for you in your endeavors.